The tray hit the floor of the dining hall before she even had time to brace herself. 1 second, she was carrying her meal back to an empty corner table. The next, a hand had fisted around the back of her collar and yanked, hard enough to pop the top button loose. And Staff Sergeant Claire Donovan stumbled forward into the center of the room while 40 soldiers watched and said absolutely nothing. The laughter came fast. It always did. She had survived 3 combat deployments, 2 classified extractions, and 1 mission that the Army had buried so deep it no longer officially existed. She had put rounds through targets at distances that most soldiers couldn't even see. None of that was in her file anymore. What the room saw was a 34-year-old woman in a wrinkled uniform picking her spilled food off the floor while an officer stood over her and smiled. Before that night was over, every single person who laughed would be begging her not to leave. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe right now. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button and stay until the very end, because what happens in the dark hours before sunrise is something you will not see coming. The dining hall at Fort Callum smelled the way it always did after 9 o'clock. Burnt coffee, industrial cleaner, and something in the fryers that had been recycled one too many times. Claire had timed her arrival deliberately. Late enough that the main rush was gone. Early enough that she could eat before the overnight communication shift started at 2200. She'd been doing it for 7 months, ever since her transfer from the Classified Operations Annex at Briar Ridge had deposited her here with a redacted service record, a lateral rank that made no sense on paper, and a reputation for being, in the exact words of her new unit commander, administratively complicated. She didn't fight the description. Fighting descriptions cost energy she'd long since stopped spending. The tray she'd taken held a plate of something labeled beef stroganoff, a dinner roll that had dried to a density approaching concrete, and a cup of black coffee she planned to drink cold in the communications room while she ran signal checks. It wasn't a meal she was looking forward to. It was fuel. She'd stopped distinguishing between the two a long time ago. She had almost made it to the far corner table, the one near the emergency exit, near the window, back to the wall, when she heard the group near the beverage station. 3 officers, one of them louder than the rest. Major Dennis Hargrove was the kind of man who filled a room by wanting to. He was big, thick-necked, with the look of someone who had been athletic in his 20s and had since substituted authority for fitness. He held his rank like it was a physical object he could swing at people, and at Fort Callum, with its revolving door of reassigned personnel and administrative transfers, there was never a shortage of people to swing it at. Claire had been aware of him since her 2nd week on base. He'd clocked her during formation, the quiet one with the vague file, and she'd watched his expression cycle through confusion, dismissal, and finally the particular brand of mild contempt that men like him reserved for people they couldn't immediately categorize. She should have taken a different route to the corner table. She almost did. But the dining hall layout gave her 2 options, and the second one passed directly behind Hargrove's group, which meant she would have been visible longer, which felt worse. So she took the shorter path, kept her eyes straight ahead, and walked with the deliberate neutrality she'd practiced in a lot of rooms that didn't want her in them. She was 3 feet past him when it happened. No warning, no preceding comment, just a hand closing around the back of her collar, the grip fast and contemptuous, the way you'd grab something you wanted to move out of your way. And then the yank, sudden and hard, and the tray tilting forward and gravity doing the rest. The stroganoff went first, then the coffee. The dinner roll hit the linoleum last, bouncing once before rolling to a stop near the boot of a corporal who immediately looked somewhere else. Claire didn't fall. She caught herself against the edge of a table with one hand and managed to stay upright, which was either good instinct or just years of having the ground yanked out from under her in various configurations. She straightened slowly, breathing through her nose. The laughter started from Hargrove's table and spread outward like a dropped frequency finding its range. "Watch where you're going, Sergeant." Hargrove hadn't moved. He was still holding his coffee, still angled toward his companions, as though grabbing a passing soldier by the collar had been a reflex so minor it didn't warrant full attention. He glanced at her sideways. "Actually, who are you? You're the one from the comms annex, right? The transfer?" Claire looked at him. She didn't answer immediately. Not because she was slow, but because she was deciding what answering was worth. "Donovan," she said. "Donovan." He repeated the name without inflection, the way people repeated things they didn't intend to remember. He turned to his companions. "This the one Reyes was talking about?" The one with the mystery file? The younger officer beside him, a lieutenant with a fresh creaser in his uniform and the eager expression of someone still performing competence rather than possessing it, said, "I think so, sir. No deployment record that anybody can actually read. She's on the overnight comms rotation." Hargrove looked back at her. His expression was mild in the way that people were mild when they had already decided they didn't need to make an effort. "Overnight comms," he said. "Radio checks." "Yes, sir." "So you're what? Dead weight with a headset?" He smiled. "Not the performative kind. The smaller, quieter kind that people deployed when they thought the other person couldn't touch them." "You hiding behind paperwork, Donovan, or just behind clearance levels no one can actually verify?" The room was not silent. There was still the hiss of the fryers, the low murmur of distant conversations. But the tables nearest them had gone quiet in the way that soldiers went quiet when they recognized a dynamic and were calculating the cost of involvement. No one calculated it favorably. Claire crouched and began picking up her tray. She gathered the dinner roll first, set it back on the tray, then the plate with the spillage. The coffee cup had rolled and she collected that too. She moved without hurry, without the hunched quality of shame, but also without the rigid deliberateness of performance. She was just picking things up because they needed to be picked up. When she stood, Hargrove was still watching her with that mild expression. "Nothing to say?" he asked. "I have a shift starting in 40 minutes, she said. "I need to eat something before it starts." "Then maybe you should watch where you're walking." "You grabbed my collar, sir." The silence that followed was the specific kind that came when someone said a true thing at the wrong social temperature. Hargrove's expression didn't shift dramatically. His eyes just narrowed slightly, a recalibration, not a retreat. "Careful, Sergeant." "Good night, sir." She carried her empty tray to the disposal station, left it there, and walked out of the dining hall. Behind her, the laughter resumed, but it was smaller than before, and she caught at least one voice underneath it that didn't sound quite right, too forced, hitting a note that was slightly off. The sound of someone laughing because they decided they should, rather than because they actually wanted to. She didn't turn around to identify who. The walk from the dining hall to the communications building took Claire past 3 checkpoints, 2 generator stations, and the long windowless stretch of wall that separated the base's administrative sector from its training ranges. At 9:45 on a Tuesday night in October, Fort Callum was running on skeleton staff. Most of the day shift personnel had cycled out hours ago. The overnight rotations were lean by design. Fort Callum wasn't a forward operating base. It was a logistics and training installation in the high desert of southern Nevada, and its overnight security posture reflected that. Or that was the official assessment. Claire had her own assessment, which she kept to herself. She stopped outside the communications building, tilted her head back, and looked at the sky for a moment. Clear. Wind from the northwest, maybe 8 knots. Low humidity. A night for good visibility, if visibility mattered to anything out here. Then she went inside. The communications room was a long, narrow space full of equipment that was 3 generations behind current spec, but functioned adequately for a non-combat installation. Banks of radio consoles ran the left wall. On the right, signal routing panels with their colored indicators blinked in steady patterns. The ceiling fluorescence threw flat, depthless light over everything. Specialist Tobias Marin was the only other person in the room. He was 22, from rural Minnesota, and approached his work with the kind of earnest reliability that Claire found quietly admirable in the way she found most functional things admirable. Not with warmth, but with practical respect. He looked up when she came in. "Heard about the dining hall," he said. Claire sat at her console and began her startup sequence. "Already?" Corporal Estevez texts fast. You okay?" "I'm fine, Marin." "Because Hargrove's kind of a... Start your frequency checks," she said. Not harshly, just redirecting. He turned back to his console. She heard him mutter something under his breath. Agreement, probably. And then the room settled into the familiar rhythm of overnight communications work. The static and the sweep, the check and the confirm, the quiet professionalism of people keeping a system alive while most of its users slept. Claire ran her checks methodically. Primary frequency bands across the installation, secondary emergency channels. The satellite uplink that connected Fort Callum to the wider communications grid. Everything reporting normal, green across the board. She made a note in the log and settled into the mid-shift quiet. For a while she just worked, and the dining hall receded into the category of things she had already processed and filed. Not forgotten. She didn't forget things. That was the problem. But filed. She had a system. Events went into the system. The system didn't bleed into work. She was an hour into the shift when the first anomaly appeared. It was small. A flicker on the perimeter security feed integration, not her primary responsibility, but the comms room received secondary data from the base's sensor network, and Claire monitored it the way she monitored everything, continuously and in the background. The flicker lasted less than 2 seconds. Perimeter Sector 3, northeast corner. A signal dropout that the system logged as environmental interference and automatically cleared. Claire looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the atmospheric conditions logged from the weather station. Clear sky, no precipitation. Wind from the northwest at 8 knots, not from the northeast, where the sensor had dropped. Environmental interference from a direction the weather wasn't coming from. She pulled up the perimeter logs for the previous 6 hours. 3 similar dropouts. Each one logged as environmental. Each one in a different sector, spaced irregularly, never consecutive. The pattern of a system test rather than equipment failure, but also the pattern of someone mapping a sensor network without triggering consecutive alarms. She sat very still. "Marin," she said quietly. "Yeah?" "When did Perimeter System last run a diagnostic?" He pulled up the maintenance schedule. 14 days ago. Next one's scheduled for Thursday. Run one now." He turned in his chair. "At 22:40? That's not... I know it's not scheduled. Run it anyway." He hesitated, the way people hesitated when something outside normal protocol was requested by someone with no obvious authority to request it. Then something in her tone, or her face, or some quality of the stillness with which she was watching the screen, made him turn back to his console and begin the diagnostic sequence. The diagnostic ran for 3 minutes and 20 seconds. When it completed, the board showed a result that wasn't supposed to be possible. 4 sensors in perimeter sectors 2, 3, 5, and 7 had been cycled into a diagnostic loop. Not the diagnostic Claire had just initiated, but a separate external loop that was mimicking the appearance of functioning while feeding the monitoring system a data stream from 6 hours ago. Someone had spoofed 4 perimeter sensors. "Marin," Claire said. Her voice was completely flat. "Get on the emergency channel right now and contact the duty officer. Tell them we have a compromised perimeter. Tell them to..." The lights went out, all of them. Every fluorescent panel, every status indicator, every monitor. A total blackout that lasted exactly 1 second before the emergency system kicked in, flooding the room with the sharp red of backup lighting. The radio consoles came back up on emergency power. Most of them. 2 didn't, including the primary frequency band that handled base-wide emergency broadcasts. Marin's face in the red light was the particular shade of pale that came before understanding fully arrived. "What is happening?" he said. Not a question, a sentence that had lost its ending. "Someone cut the primary id," Claire said. She was already moving, already pulling the manual override panel from the equipment rack beside her console. "Get on the secondary band. Use the tactical frequency, not the admin net, the tactical net. Say we have a priority 1 security compromise, and we need the duty officer on comms right now." "I've never transmitted a priority 1. It's the same as a priority 2, except you say it louder, and you don't wait for confirmation before you repeat it." She had the manual override open. Inside was the backup transmitter, older, independent power, not connected to the main grid. She began configuring it with hands that moved quickly and without visible hesitation. "Go, Marin." He went. She heard him on the secondary band behind her, his voice doing a reasonable impression of controlled under the circumstances, calling out the priority 1 contact request. She tuned the backup transmitter and began scanning across the frequencies she needed. The first sounds she picked up were not what she was expecting. They came in fragments, burst transmissions, short and encrypted, but on a frequency that matched no Fort Callum operational band she had ever been issued. The encryption pattern was sophisticated but not military standard, private, purpose-built, the kind that well-funded non-state actors used when they wanted communications that law enforcement couldn't immediately intercept, but that didn't require the overhead of nation-state cryptography. She listened for 11 seconds. The transmissions had a rhythm. Call and response. Multiple units, at least 4, operating in coordinated movement. They weren't on the perimeter anymore. They were inside it. "Marin, stop transmitting," she said. "But I've got the duty officer responding." "Stop. Now." He stopped. She could hear his breathing from across the room. She kept her voice low and even. "The duty officer's comms are potentially compromised. If they're monitoring our transmissions, we just told them exactly where command response is coming from and what frequency we're using. Get off that band and stay off it." Silence. "Then what do we do?" Marin asked. Claire stared at the backup transmitter, at the encrypted burst signals still flickering across the scanner, at the red-lit walls of a communications room that was, as of approximately 60 seconds ago, the only node on Fort Callum that had a functioning independent transmitter that wasn't tied to the main grid, which meant it was also the only node from which someone could make a call that the people outside couldn't intercept, if she used it correctly, if she knew what she was doing. She hadn't used a tactical backscatter frequency in 3 years. The last time had been in a burned building in a country whose name she wasn't cleared to mention in a report that still didn't exist in any database she could access. She remembered the frequency. She remembered a lot of things that her current files said she'd never learned. "I need you to do exactly what I tell you," she said to Marin. "And I need you to do it without asking me why, because we don't have time for me to explain, and you have to trust that I know what I'm doing." In the red light, Marin looked at her, really looked, the way people looked when they were deciding whether a person was worth trusting at speed. "Okay," he said. "Close the blast shutters on the windows. Lock the exterior door. Physical bolt, not electronic. Then get under the console with the emergency kit and stay down. The kit has a handheld unit. Keep it on, but don't transmit unless I tell you." "Where are you going?" She was already pulling her jacket on. "To find out how bad this is," she said. The base at night had a specific texture that most people never bothered to learn because most people assumed they were safe in it. Claire had never assumed she was safe anywhere. She came out of the communications building through the service entrance rather than the main door, a habit that had no tactical basis she could explain to someone who'd never needed it, and stopped in the shadow of the door frame to let her eyes adjust. The backup lighting along the main corridors was still running on emergency power, casting low amber pools every 50 feet. Beyond those pools, the base was dark. Not the normal dark of a building with its lights off. A denser dark. The dark of systems that had been deliberately killed. She moved along the wall toward the vehicle depot. She needed high ground. She needed a clear sight line to as much of the base as possible. She needed to understand the geometry of what was happening before she could do anything useful about it. The first explosion came from the direction of the eastern barracks. Not massive. Not a vehicle bomb or a munitions detonation. Controlled, shaped, a breaching charge designed to open a door or a wall rather than destroy the structure behind it. She felt it more than heard it, a compression through the air, and then the secondary sound following a half-second later, the way sound moved at distance. The second came from the motor pool, 30 seconds after the first. Then the third, from somewhere near the fuel storage, and this one she felt in her sternum because it was bigger, less controlled. The sound of something that had been meant to be smaller but hadn't quite been. She stopped walking, leaned against the wall, breathed. She was counting, timing the intervals, listening to the shape of what was happening. 3 breach points. Eastern barracks, motor pool, fuel storage. Spread across the base in a triangle that covered the 3 most operationally critical nodes besides communications. If you wanted to neutralize a base without destroying it entirely, if you wanted to control it rather than eliminate it, those were the 3 points you hit first. These people had done their homework. She reached the vehicle depot and moved around its south side to the exterior ladder that ran up to the maintenance catwalk above the service bays. The ladder was cold under her hands. She climbed fast, her boots finding the rungs without needing to look, and came up onto the catwalk with the whole southwestern quadrant of Fort Callum spread out below her. What she saw confirmed what the timing had told her. There were at least 8 distinct figures moving through the base. She could see them as darker shapes against the amber emergency lighting, moving in pairs with the practiced efficiency of people who had rehearsed this. They were armed. The silhouettes showed long weapons, and at least 2 of the pairs moved with the covered geometry of a 2-man element that had trained together. She also saw something that the briefing pattern hadn't predicted. The eastern barracks, where most of Fort Callum's off-duty personnel slept, had soldiers streaming out of the emergency exits, disoriented, without weapons, some of them only half-dressed. The breach had driven them out rather than trapped them in, which meant the attackers weren't there to kill everyone in the barracks. They were hurting them. She watched long enough to confirm the direction. The soldiers from the barracks were being pushed by the controlled chaos of the breach and the direction the threat was coming from, toward the main parade ground, an open space with clear lines of fire from multiple elevated positions around the base. Someone was creating a kill zone, or a hostage concentration point. The two looked almost identical until the moment when they became different. She needed to know which before she did anything else. She climbed down from the catwalk, crossed to the armory via the interior service corridor, a route she had mapped during her third week on base, not because she expected to need it, but because she mapped every installation she was assigned to as a matter of habit she'd never managed to turn off, and reached the armory's secondary entrance. The lock was electronic. The power was out. She stood in front of it for 2 seconds, then pulled her keyring from her pocket. The armory had a manual override that required a physical key held by personnel with armory access. Claire was not on the armory access list. She had not been authorized for weapons access since her transfer to Fort Callum. What she had was a key cut to an override pattern that she should not have known existed, that she had carried for 3 years without being able to explain why she'd never surrendered it after Briar Ridge. The Army would have a great many things to say about that later. Right now, the lock turned. She pushed the door open and moved into the dark. The armory smelled of oil and sealed metal. She moved along the racks without needing light. She'd been in enough armories that the layout was almost generic, the logic of weapons storage following patterns that repeated across installations. She found the precision rifles in the third rack on the left. Her hand closed around the stock of a M2010 enhanced sniper rifle before she'd consciously decided that was what she was reaching for. She lifted it from the rack, checked the action by feel. Her hands remembered what her career record no longer admitted: the weight, the balance, the specific relationship between her palm and the grip that was as particular as a signature. She found 2 magazines in the adjacent storage box, checked them, seated one in the well. Then she stood in the dark of the armory and gave herself exactly 10 seconds to be afraid. She used all 10. Then she picked up the rifle and went back out into the night. The armory was in the base's western sector, which put it roughly equidistant from the main parade ground to the east and the abandoned observation tower at the base's northwest corner, a legacy structure from Fort Callum's earlier configuration, now officially decommissioned, stripped of its equipment, but still standing because the Army did not remove infrastructure that was merely obsolete, only infrastructure that was actively in the way. She went to the tower first, not because it was the closest elevated position, because it was the right one. The northwest angle gave her sight lines into 3 of the 4 quadrants of the base. The parade ground was visible from its upper platform at roughly 400 meters, within her comfort range and, more importantly, within the range at which she could identify what was happening to the soldiers being herded there before she did anything she couldn't undo. The tower stairs were deteriorating but intact. She took them at a controlled pace, testing each landing before committing her full weight, one hand on the rail, the rifle held clear of obstacles. The wind was stronger up here. She felt it when she emerged onto the platform, coming out of the northwest as she'd predicted, a consistent 8-knot push from a direction she'd already accounted for. She settled into the northeast corner of the platform, the position that gave her the greatest angle into the parade ground while keeping the bulk of the tower structure at her back. The parapet was waist-high, enough to brace against without silhouetting herself against the sky. She raised the rifle, settled her cheek against the stock, let the scope picture resolve. 430 meters to the far edge of the parade ground. She calculated the adjustment automatically, without having to think about it, the way you calculated things you'd done so many times they'd stopped requiring thought. The parade ground had approximately 40 soldiers in it, some sitting, some standing, 2 armed figures at the north entrance, 2 more at the south. Their weapons were oriented inward. Hostage concentration point. Not a kill zone, at least not yet. She tracked the perimeter of the scene, cataloging what she could see. 3 of the armed figures were wearing body armor of a commercial pattern, the kind available through private military contractors, not the kind issued by any recognizable national military. Their movements were practiced but not uniform. Different training backgrounds, working to a common plan. At least 2 of them were giving directions by hand signal rather than radio, which meant either their communications protocol was discipline-based or they were aware of the possibility of interception. She counted the figures she could positively identify, then the ones she could see partially, then estimated the probable positions of the ones she couldn't see based on the coverage pattern of the ones she could. 8 she could account for. An unknown number she couldn't. She lowered the rifle for a moment and looked at the situation with her bare eyes, the larger picture, the gestalt of it, the thing that individual scope views couldn't show her. The base was held, partially, imperfectly, with a force that was organized but not overwhelming. The attackers had executed their plan up to this point with competence, but the plan had a pressure point. They needed the hostages cooperative, and they needed the base quiet for long enough to accomplish whatever the actual objective was, which meant they didn't want prolonged combat. They wanted the situation to resolve in their favor quickly, which meant she had a window that would close the moment they realized there was someone operating freely on the base who hadn't been corralled or neutralized. She had to be careful. She had to be precise. She had to make every action count, because the moment she fired the first shot, she became a variable in their plan, and variables got hunted. She raised the rifle again, found the figure at the north entrance who had his back to the hostages and was scanning the perimeter, the one whose attention was outward rather than inward, whose posture suggested he was expecting something to happen in the darkness outside the parade ground. He was a threat to the hostages if things went wrong, but right now, he was also her best diagnostic. The way he moved, the frequency of his scans, the pattern of his attention told her how much they knew about what was still out there. He was scanning regularly, systematically. He didn't know she was here. She exhaled slowly. The wind pushed once, died, pushed again. In the maintenance corridor, 2 buildings behind her, a door banged open and someone ran through it, a soldier, half-dressed, fleeing something. And the sudden noise cracked through the night air like a physical thing, and the figure at the north entrance snapped his attention toward it, and every other armed figure in her sightline reacted in the same half-second, which was the precise moment that Claire Donovan's crosshairs settled, and her breathing slowed to nothing, and 3 years of a buried history came back into her hands like a current finding its ground. She did not fire. Not yet. But she had her answer. They still didn't know she existed, and that was the most dangerous thing in the world for them. The soldier who'd burst through the maintenance corridor door was Private First Class Anaya Osei, 19 years old, from Atlanta, and she was running on pure adrenaline and no information whatsoever. Claire watched her through the scope long enough to confirm she wasn't being followed, then tracked back to the parade ground. The armed figure at the north entrance had registered the noise, held his scan position for 4 seconds, then relaxed back into his pattern. He'd written it off. A fleeing soldier was expected noise. It fit the picture he already had of the situation. Good. Claire kept watching. The hostages on the parade ground had shifted during the disturbance. She could see the ripple of it, people standing up, people grabbing each other's arms. And the 2 armed figures inside the perimeter had responded by moving tighter, closing the radius of control, which meant they were operating with a smaller margin than they projected. Nervous. Not panicking, but not as steady as they wanted to look. She filed that. Then she climbed down from the tower. Osei was crouched against the exterior wall of the maintenance corridor when Claire came around the corner, and the girl nearly came out of her skin, a sharp intake of breath, both hands coming up instinctively, the body language of someone who had decided in the last 3 minutes that every shadow was a threat. "Easy," Claire said quietly. "I'm Army. Stand down." Osei stared at her. She was in a t-shirt and PT shorts, barefoot, which meant the breach at the Eastern Barracks had pulled her out of bed. There was a cut above her left ear, minor, already clotting, from something in the chaos. "Who are you?" Osei's voice was holding together, but barely. "Donovan. Communications. Were you in the Eastern Barracks when the breach happened?" "I was asleep. The wall just... There was the sound, and then the emergency lights, and everyone was running, and someone was shouting to get out, get to the parade ground, and I..." She stopped, swallowed. "I didn't go to the parade ground." "Why not?" "Because the person shouting us toward it wasn't in uniform." Claire looked at her for a moment, 19 years old, barefoot, bleeding slightly from the head, and she'd caught the detail that had probably saved her from the hostage pool. "Good call," Claire said. "Stay close. Don't make noise. Do exactly what I say when I say it." Do you have a plan? I have information. Plans come after. She moved toward the service corridor entrance. Come on. The communications building was the same red-lit sealed box she'd left 15 minutes ago. She rapped twice on the exterior door, the knock pattern she'd established with Marin before leaving, and heard the bolt slide back. Marin opened the door 4 inches, saw her, opened it the rest of the way. He saw Osei, and his expression asked the question. Eastern Barracks, Claire said. She's clear. She came inside and Marin bolted the door behind them. The room felt smaller than it had before the lights went out. Marin had moved equipment to create a more defensible arrangement. He'd pulled the heaviest console rack to partially block the window view from outside, which was either good tactical instinct or coincidence. Claire decided it didn't matter which. I reached someone, Marin said. He was trying to keep his voice level and mostly succeeding. On the backup handheld, there's at least one other person loose on the base, Sergeant First Class Wes Tanner, from the motor pool. He's sheltering in the secondary fuel depot. He's got a radio, but it's short range. Did he give you anything on the attackers? He said he counted 6 when they hit the motor pool. Full kit, moved like they'd done it before. He said, Marin hesitated. He said one of them was giving orders in English, clean English, no accent. Claire absorbed that. Okay. That's bad, right? That they're English speaking? It's information, she said. What's the handheld's range? 300 meters, maybe 4 in good conditions. So Tanner can talk to us, but not to anyone outside that radius. She looked at the backup transmitter she'd configured before leaving. It was still running, still scanning. Marin, I need you to reach back out to the tactical frequency, not the emergency net, the backscatter channel I configured before I left. There's a bandwidth there that runs outside the base's internal network. If this reaches anyone outside the perimeter, it goes on that channel. I don't know that frequency. I set it before I left. Second console from the left. The manual tuner is already positioned. Transmit on that band, identify as Fort Callum, and use the salute format. She paused, looked at his face. Do you know salute format? Size, activity, location, unit, time, equipment, he said, a little quickly, the recitation of someone who'd learned it and never expected to use it operationally. Right. Give whoever picks it up the best count you have. Perimeter breach, multiple armed personnel, approximately 40 hostages on the main parade ground, base grid systems down, communications compromised except for this node. Then you give this frequency and you stay on it. You don't stop transmitting on a regular interval until someone acknowledges. And if no one picks it up, then you keep transmitting. He nodded. He was scared, but he was doing the thing, that particular quality that Claire had always found more useful than bravery, which was the ability to be afraid and work anyway. Osei had found a chair in the corner and pulled it close to the wall, her bare feet tucked up off the linoleum. She was watching Claire with an expression that was partly shock and partly the careful assessment of someone trying to figure out what kind of person they'd attach themselves to. What are you going to do? Osei asked. Find out what they actually want. You don't know? I know what they're doing. I don't know why yet. Those are different problems with different solutions. Claire checked the rifle. She'd leaned it against the console when she came in, and now she picked it up and did a quick check by feel, a habit so ingrained it happened without conscious direction. Installations like this one don't get hit for the personnel. You hit a logistics and training base because you want something the base has. Equipment, data, materials, access to a system that runs through here. Osei was quiet for a moment. The depot, she said. What depot? There's a... She stopped, looked uncertain. I overheard something. Last week. The officers were talking about a shipment coming through. Something sensitive. I don't know what, I just heard the word classified and Major Hargrove telling someone it was a 48-hour transit stop. It would be gone by Thursday. Claire went very still. What day did it arrive? She asked. I don't know. I just heard them talking on Monday. Monday, 2 days ago. A 48-hour transit stop put the departure at Wednesday. Tomorrow. Where do transit shipments stage? She asked. Not the main depot, for classified transit. I think Building 11? The secure storage annex. It's on the western edge, near the perimeter, Claire said. Near the point where the sensor spoofing had first appeared. near the northwestern sector where the attackers had chosen to run their initial penetration. The objective wasn't the hostages. The hostages were the mechanism, the thing that kept Fort Callum's personnel occupied and pinned and unable to respond coherently, while a separate element went for Building 11. She should have mapped that faster. She counted the seconds she'd lost on the assumption that the parade ground was the end goal rather than the distraction, and the count was uncomfortable, and she set it aside. "Is there any communication with Building 11? She asked Marin. He checked, shook his head. "It's on the main grid. It's dark." "Guard rotation? I'd have to pull the duty roster, and that's..." He pulled up the local file. 2-man post, 4-hour rotations. The overnight shift started at 2100, which meant 2 soldiers had been sitting in Building 11 when the power went out. No communications, no backup lighting in a structure that was off the emergency network. 2 guards who either had their own radios or were sitting in the dark with no idea what was happening around them, or they'd already been reached. She looked at the rifle, looked at the door. "I need to get to Building 11, she said. "You're going back out there?" Osei said. "Someone has to." She didn't say it as a point, just a fact. "You're one person with a rifle." "I'm aware." Osei stood up from the chair. Her jaw was set in the specific way of someone making a decision they hadn't fully processed yet. "I'm coming with you." "No. I'm not sitting in here." "You're barefoot," Claire said. "The terrain between here and Building 11 has broken glass from the depot breach. You'll cut your feet and slow me down, and I can't cover you in the objective." She looked at Osei steadily. "You're more useful here. If Marin reaches someone on the outside, they're going to need someone to give them a ground-level layout of the base. You know where the hostages are, you know the breach points, you know about Building 11. That's what an outside response team needs to walk in with." It was true. It was also, in a way Claire didn't fully examine, gentler than it needed to be. She could have just said no and left. She'd taken an extra 30 seconds to give Osei something real to do. She wasn't sure when she'd started doing that. Osei sat back down, not happily, but deliberately. "Building 11, she said, "western perimeter, 3rd structure from the northwest corner. Service entrance is on the south side. The main door faces west." "Thank you," Claire said. She unbolted the door, checked the line of sight outside, and slipped back into the darkness. The western sector of Fort Callum was the oldest part of the installation. Original construction, low cinder block buildings, the kind of functional architecture that had been built fast after the war and then simply never replaced because it kept working. The emergency lighting here was sparser, the amber pools farther apart, the shadows between them deeper. Claire moved along the edge of the vehicle's storage yard, using the bulk of the parked trucks as cover. The rifle was slung across her back. At this range, in these corridors, a long gun was a liability. She needed her hands free and her profile narrow. She was halfway to Building 11 when she heard them. 2 voices, low, coming from somewhere ahead and to the right. English. The cadence was clipped. Professional brevity, people conserving communication. She stopped, pressed herself into the shadow of a parked LMTV, let her breathing slow. "Element 2 is 90 seconds out," one voice said. "We need the door open." "I'm working on it," a second voice, slightly higher, frustrated. "The manual override is a different system. It's not tied to the grid. I need 3 minutes." "You have 90 seconds. "Then someone else needs to work on the door." A silence. "Get Vasquez," the first voice said. Footsteps moving away. Claire stayed motionless for another 4 seconds, mapping what she'd heard. Element 2. A second team, currently in motion, 90 seconds from Building 11. Which meant they were already inside the perimeter at a location she hadn't tracked. And the door problem meant the target was still secure. The guards were either still inside or neutralized and the door locked behind them, and the attackers hadn't breached it yet. 90 seconds was not much time. She came around the front of the LMTV slowly, angled to see the area ahead without exposing herself, and found what she was looking for. 2 figures at the south entrance of Building 11. One crouched at the door mechanism, one standing with his back to her, watching the direction the first voice had gone. 40 feet. Poor light. Her sidearm was in the armory. She hadn't taken it because she'd gone back for the rifle and hadn't anticipated needing both. She was holding a precision rifle at a range where a precision rifle was exactly the wrong tool. She unslung it anyway, because it was what she had. Then she did the thing that her current file said she'd never been trained to do. She calculated the exact angle at which she could use the rifle as a close-range deterrent without firing it and without putting herself in a position where the second figure, the one at the door, could draw and fire before she could address both of them. The geometry was possible. Barely. She came out of the shadow of the LMTV moving, low and fast, covering the 40 feet in the time it took the standing figure to register the sound of her boots on gravel and begin to turn. She had the muzzle against his shoulder before he completed the turn. "Don't," she said quietly. Flat. No performance to it. He froze. His hands came up slowly, training response, muscle memory. And in the fraction of a second where he was processing what was happening, she stripped the sidearm from his holster with her left hand and stepped back, creating distance, putting him between her and the figure at the door. The figure at the door had turned. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 25, with the look of someone doing something he'd prepared for but hadn't entirely believed he'd actually be doing. His hand was moving toward his own sidearm. "Don't," she said again. Same tone, same flatness. He stopped. "Hands visible," she said. "Both of you." They complied, slowly. The kind of slow that wasn't cooperation so much as buying time, both of them reading the situation, measuring it, looking for the angle. The first one, the one she'd disarmed, spoke first. "There are 14 of us on this installation," he said. He was keeping his voice neutral, trying to establish a frame. "You're one person." "That's what I keep hearing," Claire said. "You can't hold this position. Element 2 arrives in..." He paused. "Maybe 60 seconds now. You're going to be surrounded. Then I suggest you tell me what's in Building 11 before that becomes my problem." He looked at her, reassessing. The initial read, a lone soldier stumbling into a situation she didn't understand, was being revised in real time, and she could see him revising it. "You're not base security," he said. "No." "Who are you?" She didn't answer. She was watching both of them, watching the door, watching the angle where Element 2 would emerge from when they arrived, running geometry in the background the way she always ran geometry, continuously and without effort, the same way she breathed. "What's in the building?" she asked again. "A transit shipment." "I know that. What kind?" Silence. "Encrypted drive systems," the younger one at the door said. The first one cut a sharp look at him. The younger one's jaw tightened. "She's going to find out in about 45 seconds anyway." Claire looked at the first one. "Encrypted drive systems." "Battlefield management infrastructure," he said, after a beat, with the expression of someone who decided it didn't matter anymore what he said, because the situation was already past the point where information control was meaningful. 3 drives. Contain the architecture for an encrypted tactical communications network. Military. High value. 3 drives. Small, portable, specific. The kind of thing you could carry out on your person. The kind of thing you could extract through a perimeter breach in the dark. "Who sent you?" she asked. Neither of them answered. She heard it then, the sound of footsteps, more than 2, coming from the north side of Building 11. Element 2. They'd either had a shorter route than the 60-second estimate or they'd been running. She had approximately 8 seconds. She looked at the door to Building 11. The manual override mechanism the younger one had been working on, she could see it from here, a recessed panel beside the door. Partially accessed. He'd been close. She moved to the door in 3 steps, keeping the disarmed man in her peripheral vision, keeping the sidearm she'd taken from him raised but not pointed at either of them directly. The geometry of control that worked only as long as neither of them decided to rush her. The manual override panel was a 3-stage system. She'd seen the same design at 2 other installations. She worked it fast, using the muscle memory of hands that had opened doors like this in conditions where taking longer than 10 seconds was not survivable. The lock disengaged on the 8th second. She shoved the door open, moved inside, and pulled it shut behind her. The mechanism relocked automatically. She was in. The interior of Building 11 was dark in the absolute sense. No emergency lighting, no windows, nothing. She stood for 2 seconds at the entrance with her hand on the door, listening to the sounds of Element 2 arriving outside, listening to the voices sharpen into urgency as they found the door locked, and their 2 colleagues standing with their hands visible. Then she moved. The building's layout was a long central corridor with storage rooms branching off either side. She felt the architecture more than saw it, one hand on the wall, counting doorways. The secure storage would be at the back, the deepest point, the room furthest from any entrance. She was counting doorways when the voice came from ahead of her in the dark. "Who's there?" Not a question, a statement with a weapon behind it. "Donovan," she said immediately. "Staff Sergeant, Communications. There are armed personnel outside this building trying to breach the door. If you're the overnight guard, I need you to talk to me right now." A silence. The specific silence of someone pointing a gun into the dark at a sound. "Donovan?" The voice was male, cautious, young. "What's the password for the overnight rotation?" "I don't have it. I'm communications staff. I came through the manual override on the south entrance." She kept her voice flat, factual. "The base has been breached. Perimeter sensors were spoofed starting around 2200 hours. Grid power was cut. I have reason to believe the objective is the shipment in this building. I need to know if your communications are working." Another silence. Shorter this time. "Radio's been out since the power dropped," the voice said. "We've been sitting blind." "Is the shipment intact?" "Yes. Room 4. We haven't opened it." "How many of you?" "2. Martinez is with me." "Okay, good. Here's what's going to happen." She stopped. Heard something. From outside, from the south entrance. A sound she recognized as a magnetic charge being placed. Not a breaching explosive. A bypass mechanism for electronic locks. Which should have been irrelevant because the lock was manual. Unless Element 2 had someone who understood the crossover point between manual and electronic systems. Unless they'd figured out that the manual override panel had one component that could be bridged electromagnetically. She had maybe 2 minutes. "What's your name?" she asked. "Specialist Carver." "Carver, I need you to take the shipment from room 4 and I need you to move it, away from the south entrance. Find me an interior room with no external walls." "Move it where?" "We're locked in." "There's a roof access in buildings like this. Central corridor, midpoint. It's a utility ladder. Can you find it in the dark?" A beat. "Maybe." "Find it," she said. "I'll hold the entrance." She moved back toward the south door. Behind her, she heard Carver moving, heard him say something quiet to Martinez, heard the shuffle of 2 people beginning to navigate a dark corridor with something they needed to protect. She reached the entrance and positioned herself to the side of the door, back to the wall, the sidearm she'd taken from the disarmed man raised and ready. The magnetic charge outside was working. She could hear it, a low-frequency vibration through the door material that she felt more in her back teeth than her ears. She waited. Her breathing was even. Her hands were steady. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was, in the low background way she'd been afraid in every situation like this one, the fear that was information rather than paralysis. But because the last 3 years of pretending she was an ordinary communications sergeant had not, it turned out, done anything to the part of her that knew how to wait in the dark for a door to open. The magnetic charge reached its threshold. The lock mechanism made a sound that was almost electrical, almost mechanical, the sound of something being convinced against its nature to release. The door swung inward. The first figure came through fast and low, the way trained people entered unknown spaces, and Claire was already moving, not toward him, but to the side, using the door itself as a partial barrier, making herself a difficult angle. And in the half-second while he was orienting, she closed the distance and controlled his weapon arm with both hands, and drove him into the wall with the force of someone who had been trained in a program that her current file had never heard of. He went down. The second figure in the doorway stopped. In the wedge of faint light from outside, she could see him clearly enough. Taller than the first, body armor, weapon raised, the brief frozen moment of encountering something unexpected. "Building's clear," Claire said. She was lying. "Your team in the motor pool is already in custody. The outside extraction route is sealed." She was lying about that too. "You've got one move and it's back through that door." He looked at her. He looked at the man on the ground. He looked at her again. "Who the hell are you?" he said. It was, she thought, becoming a recurring question. She didn't answer it. She held his gaze across 6 feet of darkness and let the silence do the work. And after 4 seconds that felt considerably longer, he stepped back through the door, and she kicked it shut and held her weight against it. From somewhere above her, in the dark of the central corridor, she heard Carver's voice. "We found the ladder," he said. "Good," she said. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. "Get up there. Take the shipment. Don't come down until I tell you it's clear." "What are you going to do?" She looked at the door. Listened to the sounds of Element 2 reorganizing outside. Voices, movement, the particular quality of a plan that had just encountered unexpected resistance and was recalculating. They had the building surrounded. They had more personnel than she'd been able to account for. They had, presumably, ways to reach the people organizing the hostage situation on the parade ground. She had one rifle, one borrowed sidearm, and whatever time it took for whoever Marin was transmitting to on the backscatter frequency to receive that transmission and decide it was worth responding to. It wasn't a comfortable picture. She thought about the parade ground. 40 soldiers sitting in the open while armed people with a timetable stood over them. She thought about Marin in the red-lit communications room, transmitting into a frequency that might be reaching no one. She thought about Osei with her bare feet pulled off the cold linoleum, doing the things she'd been told to do because someone had given her something real to do. She thought about Hargrove standing in the dining hall with his mild, contemptuous eyes, and she thought about the officer at Fort Callum who had looked at her and seen dead weight. She hadn't shown them otherwise. She'd picked up her tray and walked away. There was a version of her that still did that, still made herself small, still moved through rooms at the edges, still let the record stand as it was. The version that had arrived at Fort Callum 7 months ago with a redacted file and a key she shouldn't have, and a rifle she hadn't touched in 3 years. That version had just put an armed man on the floor in the dark and bluffed 2 others into retreating and was currently holding a door with her body weight. The distance between those 2 versions of herself was a single bad night. She checked the sidearm. 6 rounds. She assessed the door. It would hold another 60 seconds against a coordinated push. Maybe 90. She needed to stop reacting and start moving. She pushed off the door and went back into the dark corridor, moving toward the back of the building, toward the utility ladder, toward the roof, because the roof was high ground, and high ground was the one asset she'd been using all night to compensate for everything she didn't have. She was at the base of the ladder when the handheld radio clipped to the waist of the man she'd put down crackled to life. She stopped, went back, found the radio by feel, brought it to her ear. The voice that came through the static was calm, commanding, in clean, unaccented English. Building 11 element, report status. She held the radio and said nothing. Element 2, status report. Still nothing. A pause. Then the voice again, with the patience of someone who'd already predicted this outcome. "She's in the building," the voice said. Not to her, to someone else. "Adjust the timeline. We move to phase 3 in 10 minutes. The radio went silent. Claire looked at it in her hand. Phase 3, 10 minutes. She didn't know what phase 3 was. She knew that she had 10 minutes to figure it out. She started climbing. The roof of Building 11 was flat, graveled, surrounded by a low parapet that was just high enough to matter and just low enough to be a problem if anyone outside thought to elevate their angle. Claire came through the access hatch fast and stayed low, moving to the northeast corner in a crouch, the rifle unslung and in her hands before she'd fully cleared the opening. The gravel crunched under her boots, unavoidable, and she registered it as a liability and moved past it. The wind was still coming out of the northwest, still steady, still the same 8 knots it had been when she'd been on the observation tower 40 minutes ago. It felt like a different night than that one. She came up to the parapet and looked. The base spread out below her in amber and shadow, and she read it the way she read terrain, not as individual objects, but as a system, a pattern, the way pressure moved through connected spaces. The parade ground was 260 meters to the northeast. She could see the hostages from here as a dense mass in the center of the open space, and she could see the armed perimeter around them, and she could see, this was new, 2 additional figures that hadn't been part of the count she'd made from the observation tower. They'd come in from the east. They were positioned at the parade ground's edge, facing outward, watching the approaches. The perimeter was tightening. Phase 3. She looked at the radio in her hand. 8 minutes left on the estimate the voice had given, which was an estimate she had to treat as both accurate and as something that might be wrong in either direction. She'd been in operations where the timeline compressed without warning. She'd been in operations where it stretched. The only reliable thing about a stated timeline was that it represented intent rather than guarantee. She needed more information, and she needed it in the next 2 minutes. She keyed the captured radio once, listened to the carrier frequency, keyed it again. The pattern she used was not a standard military identifier. It was something older, from a communication protocol used in a type of operation that didn't appear in training manuals. Too short, one long, too short. She held no expectation that it would mean anything to anyone on this frequency. The response came back in 4 seconds. One long, too short. She went still. Then she keyed again, working through a sequence she hadn't used in 3 years, her thumb on the transmit button, and the responses came back correctly each time. And when the sequence finished, she held the radio at arm's length and looked at it the way you looked at something that had just changed the shape of the situation you were standing in. Someone on this frequency knew the Briar Ridge confirmation protocol, which meant someone on this frequency had either been at Briar Ridge or had access to information about Briar Ridge that should not have been accessible to anyone running a private operation against a domestic military installation. She filed that. It made the picture uglier and more complicated, and she set the complication aside because she didn't have room for it right now. "Carver?" she said quietly toward the hatch. A head appeared below it. Carver was younger than she'd expected, early 20s, with a face that was holding itself very carefully together. I was carrying a hard-sided case approximately the size of a laptop bag. Martinez was behind him, a compact woman about the same age with a split lip from something that had happened before Claire arrived. "Get up here," Claire said. "Stay below the parapet." They came up. Carver moved the case to his chest and crouched. Martinez came up beside him, and her eyes went immediately to the scene on the parade ground, and something in her face shifted, the involuntary response of seeing people you recognized in a situation you couldn't immediately fix. "That's my whole unit," Martinez said. "I know. They've got Sergeant Reeves down there. He's got a heart condition. He can't—" "I know," Claire said, not dismissively, just firmly. "I need you to stay focused on what's in front of you." Martinez turned to look at her. She had the expression of someone deciding whether to push back or not, and she spent about 2 seconds on it, and then whatever she saw in Claire's face made her turn back to the parade ground without finishing the push. Carver said, "What are we doing?" "You're staying low and you're not moving until I tell you to." Claire was scanning the base perimeter systematically from the rooftop, starting at the northwest and working clockwise. "How heavy is that case?" "Maybe 15 pounds. Can you run with it?" "If I have to." "You may have to." She found what she was looking for at the south perimeter. A vehicle, dark, positioned outside the fence line at a gap she could now see clearly had been cut rather than breached with explosives. A clean cut. Pre-positioned. The extraction vehicle had been in place before the operation started. "They have an exit route on the south perimeter. The vehicle's already there. Whatever Phase 3 is, it ends with personnel and the case moving south." She looked at her watch. 6 minutes on the original estimate. Maybe less. She looked at the distance from Building 11's roof to the south perimeter gap. Roughly 400 meters. She looked at the distance from her current position to the observation tower. Back the way she'd come. 200 meters. The math was not comfortable. If she went back to the observation tower, she had the angle and the height to cover the extraction route. She also had 200 meters of exposed ground between here and there, in a base that now had more armed personnel than she'd counted, some of whom had just had a door held against them by a single person in a dark building and were going to be recalibrating their threat assessment. If she stayed on this roof, she had a shorter sightline and worse elevation, but she didn't have to cross the ground. She looked at the parapet, looked at the angle to the extraction vehicle. The roof gave her a firing line to the south perimeter gap if she used the northeast corner and accepted a steep oblique angle. It wasn't ideal. The ballistic compensation for a steep oblique at 400 meters in an 8-knot crosswind on a cold night was not something she could run through a firing computer, because she didn't have a firing computer. She had done this before without one. She settled into the northeast corner of the parapet, went prone, and began working out the position. The rifle's bipod deployed from the foregrip. She extended it and set it on the parapet edge. Her body angled to account for the oblique. She ran the elevation adjustment by feel, moving the turret through the clicks she needed based on range and angle and the wind she'd been tracking all night. Her cheek found the stock. The scope picture came up. 415 meters to the extraction vehicle. She could see it clearly. A dark panel van, civilian registration plates, backed up to the fence gap with the rear doors open. A figure leaning against the driver's side, waiting. She tracked to the gap itself. The cut fence edge. The ground between the gap and Building 11's south entrance, which was the route the extraction would use. Then she tracked back to the parade ground. If Phase 3 involved moving the hostages, if the plan was to take a subset of hostages as additional leverage for the extraction, she needed to be able to respond to the parade ground and the extraction route simultaneously, which was a geometrically impossible ask from a single static position. She'd worked with impossible geometries before. "Carver," she said, without lifting her cheek from the stock. "Yeah. When I start shooting, I need you to do two things. First thing, you take that case and you go back down the hatch and you find an interior room with no external walls, and you lock yourself in it. You do not open it for anyone who doesn't know your name, your unit designation, and the current CO's name. You got that?" "Yes." "Second thing, Martinez is going to take my radio, the handheld from my jacket pocket, left side, and she's going to transmit continuously on the frequency it's set to. She's going to say, 'Fort Callum, active contact, Phase 3, South Perimeter extraction, hostages parade ground.' She's going to say it every 30 seconds until someone answers. Don't she do that?" Martinez said, "I can answer for myself." "Can you do that?" "Yes." "Then get the radio." Martinez reached over and pulled the handheld from Claire's pocket. She didn't ask why Claire wasn't the one transmitting. She looked at the radio and looked at the roof around her and looked at Claire lying prone behind a rifle on the parapet, and she figured it out. Claire heard her begin transmitting behind her. The words came out steady, clipped, repeated. "Fort Callum, active contact, Phase 3, South Perimeter extraction, hostages parade ground." Steady, clipped, again. 4 minutes on the original estimate. Maybe. She heard something she'd been waiting for and dreading in roughly equal measure. A change in the sound from the parade ground. The ambient noise of 40 people in a stressed, controlled group had a texture, a murmur, a shuffle, the occasional raised voice cut short, and that texture had just shifted. She could hear it even at 260 meters. A sharpening. An increase in the frequency of movement sounds. Something was happening on the parade ground. She adjusted, came up slightly, angled the scope to the northeast rather than the south. The parade ground came into view. The armed figures were moving, not toward the hostages, around them. A herding motion, pushing the group from the center toward the southern edge, compressing the mass of people toward the direction of the extraction route. They weren't taking hostages, they were moving all of them, which was a different plan than she'd read, and the difference made her recalculate everything in the 3 seconds she had to do it. Moving 40 people was slow, it was loud. It was a complication that didn't match the profile of an operation that had been clean and coordinated up to this point. You didn't move 40 people unless you needed them, not as individual leverage, but as a mass, as a screen, as something that put civilian-adjacent personnel between your extraction element and any response force that showed up. They were going to move 40 soldiers through the south perimeter gap as a human buffer for the case in Carver's hands. She went back to the south perimeter in the scope. The driver at the extraction vehicle had moved. He was at the fence gap now, and he wasn't alone. 2 more figures had appeared from the west, moving toward the gap, and one of them was carrying something large on his back, a duffel, oversized, the kind of bag you used when you needed to move equipment in a hurry and didn't want to explain what was in it. A third team, coming from the west, Building 11's west side, where the additional equipment she hadn't accounted for had apparently been staged. They had a second set of drives, or they had the thing she hadn't been thinking about because she'd been focused on the one she knew about. She didn't know what was in the duffel. She couldn't verify it from here. She had a choice between the thing she could confirm, the case in Carver's hands, the extraction vehicle, the South Gap, and the thing she didn't understand yet. Every training doctrine she'd ever absorbed said you did not take action on unknowns when you had a confirmed objective. She went with the confirmed objective. The figure closest to the fence gap was moving with purpose. He was going to be through it in 30 seconds, at the vehicle, ready to load. If she didn't act before he cleared the gap, the extraction window closed, and the operation succeeded regardless of what happened next. She inhaled, let half out, held. The wind pushed once, pushed again, steadied. She made the adjustment, 3 clicks right. The crosswind compensation for 8 knots at 415 meters on a 40-degree oblique. And the crosshairs settled on the space directly in front of the fence gap, the piece of ground that the lead figure had to cross to reach the extraction vehicle. She didn't fire at the figure. She fired at the vehicle. The shot hit the van's right front tire at 418 meters, oblique angle, cold night air, 8-knot crosswind from the northwest. The tire didn't explode the way it did in movies. It failed. A rapid deflation that dropped the van's front right corner onto the rim with a heavy clang that she heard even at this distance, the sound arriving a half-second after the shot the way sound always did. The figure at the fence gap stopped. The two figures with the duffel stopped. On the parade ground, the movement of the mass of hostages stopped, as the armed perimeter reacted to the sound. 4 seconds of stillness. Then the radio she'd taken from the man downstairs, still clipped to her belt, crackled, and the calm, commanding voice came back on. "She's on a roof," it said. "Northwest quadrant. Find her." Claire was already moving. She broke position, came off the parapet, rolled right, came up in a crouch, and moved to the northwest corner of the roof before the sentence had finished. She went prone again behind the northwest parapet, repositioned, and brought the rifle back up. The parade ground had fractured. The hostage mass was no longer moving south. The armed figures were turning, reorienting, trying to identify the shot origin, while simultaneously maintaining control of 40 people who had heard a rifle crack and were reacting the way people reacted to gunfire when they were scared and tired and had been standing in the open for an unknown period of time in the middle of the night. 3 of the hostages bolted. It was the wrong call. Tactically, running in the open gave the armed perimeter figures a reason to fire. But it was human, and Claire had accounted for it. She had the scope on the perimeter figure closest to the runners before the first of them had covered 10 meters. She didn't shoot the figure. She fired to his left. 2 meters. Into the ground. He flinched hard, the involuntary full-body response to a near impact that even trained people couldn't fully suppress, and his weapon came up and away from the runners rather than toward them. And by the time he'd reoriented, the 3 runners had reached the eastern barracks wall and were behind it. She cycled and repositioned, northwest parapet to northeast. Came up. Found the second armed figure on the parade ground perimeter, the one at the north entrance, who was now moving to engage rather than contain. She put a round past his right shoulder close enough that she saw him duck and change direction. Cycled. Repositioned, southeast parapet. The duffel carriers at the south gap were moving again. They'd recovered from the van shot, and they were pushing toward the gap faster now, one of them covering the other, the professional response to contact from an unknown position. She tracked the lead figure and fired once, not at him, at the fence gap itself, at the cut edge of the chain link, the metal screeching under impact, and the fence swinging inward and blocking the gap with its own tangled edge. Not impassable, but not fast to clear either. She heard shouting from below. Multiple voices. English and at least one other language she couldn't identify at this distance. The quality of the operation had changed. It was still functional, still organized, but the margin had compressed, and she could hear it in the voices, the way competence started to sound like effort when things didn't go according to plan. She cycled to the captured radio. "Phase 3 is compromised," she said into it flatly. "Your extraction vehicle is disabled. Your south gap is blocked. You have an unknown number of Army personnel who were not in the hostage pool who are currently mobile. I'm suggesting you consider your options." Silence. Then the calm voice. "Who are you?" "The communications sergeant," she said, the dead weight with the headset. A pause, shorter than she expected. "You fired the Briar Ridge sequence," the voice said. She said nothing. "That protocol was classified above this installation's clearance level," the voice said. "The only people who know it were in one unit, one specific unit. Most of them are dead or reassigned to positions that don't exist on paper." The voice had shifted. Not warmer, not softer, but more focused. The tone of someone who'd just received information that made them recalculate. "You weren't in the file I was given." "No," she said. "I wasn't." "What file were you in?" She didn't answer. The radio went quiet. She took the moment to scan the full roofline. She'd fired 6 times. She had 9 rounds left in the magazine. She had the 6 rounds in the borrowed sidearm. She had no reload for the rifle. This was the arithmetic of the situation. 9 and 6. 15 rounds total. Against a force she still couldn't fully quantify, on a base that was still largely dark, with a timeline that had just been disrupted but not destroyed. She thought about what the voice had said. The file I was given. Not the intelligence we developed, not our assessment. A file someone had given him, which meant a chain of custody. Someone had built the target package for this operation and handed it to this man, and in that target package, Claire Donovan had not appeared as a threat, which meant whoever had built it didn't know about Briar Ridge, or had known and removed it, or had a file that predated the parts of her record that would have mattered. All three possibilities were troubling in different ways. She set it aside again. The parade ground had partially dissolved. The perimeter had lost cohesion when she'd fired, and the armed figures were now split between maintaining control of the remaining hostages and trying to identify her position. She counted the ones she could see. 4 on the parade ground, 2 near the south gap. 1 she'd lost track of entirely. Movement at the east barracks wall caught her scope. Not hostile. Friendly. Several soldiers who'd been hiding since the initial breach were emerging from cover and moving toward the hostages. No weapons, but they were moving with intent, positioning themselves between the remaining armed figures and the hostage mass. Unarmed soldiers walking into a contested space to put their bodies between armed attackers and their people. She covered them, tracked the 2 armed figures closest to the movement, kept them in rotation, scope on one, peripheral awareness of the other, ready to cycle. Nobody fired. The armed figures were watching the movement but not reacting to it, and she understood why. Their operational math had changed. Attacking unarmed soldiers when there was an unknown shooter with demonstrated accuracy. Somewhere in the dark above them was a way to invite a response they couldn't manage. They were recalculating. They were buying time. So was she. Myron was transmitting. Martinez was transmitting. Someone on the backscatter frequency had known the Briar Ridge protocol. The question she was sitting with, the question that 8 rounds of careful position shifting could not answer, was whether any of that was going to matter before her 15 rounds ran out. She moved position again. Northeast corner. Came up slowly above the parapet. The calm voice came back on the captured radio. Last chance to stand down, it said. We leave the base intact. We leave the personnel intact. We take what we came for and we're gone. No one else gets hurt tonight. What did you come for? She asked. The drives in Building 11 or the duffel from the west side? A silence. Both, the voice said. That's what I thought, she said. What's in the duffel? No answer. She looked at the south gap. The 2 figures with the duffel had cleared the tangled fence edge. She'd known they would. She'd bought time, not stopped them. And they were at the van now, working on the disabled tire with the focused urgency of people who had a contingency plan. The van wasn't going anywhere on a blown rim, but there were other vehicles. She'd seen them map the motor pool during the initial breach. They'd gone there first for a reason. They're going for a vehicle from the motor pool, she said. Not into the radio, to herself, to the empty roof, to the habit of stating the problem out loud because it sometimes clarified what she needed to do about it. She looked at the motor pool, 200 meters west-southwest, behind cover from her current position. The motor pool vehicles were behind a low berm that blocked her sight line to the vehicles themselves, though she could see the entrance. She needed to stop the duffel from reaching a vehicle. She needed to do it with 8 rounds and a borrowed sidearm. And she needed to do it without losing the parade ground. She came fully upright on the roof. It was not a tactically sound decision. Standing at full height on a flat rooftop when there were armed personnel below looking for her position was not a decision that any instructor she'd ever had would have endorsed. She did it because she needed the angle to the motor pool entrance, and the angle required the height, and the calculation she was running in the background was telling her that the value of the shot outweighed the exposure. And she had learned a long time ago to trust that calculation, even when the rest of her was unhappy about it. She found the motor pool entrance in the scope. The 2 figures with the duffel were moving toward it. She could see them at the far edge of her sight line, crossing the open ground between the south perimeter and the motor pool at a run, 60 meters from the entrance. 50. She adjusted for the new range, for the angle, for the wind. She fired once. At the ground in front of the motor pool entrance, the piece of gravel and packed earth that the lead figure's next step would have landed on. He stopped, changed direction, went right instead of forward. Right was better than the motor pool. Right was open ground with no cover for another 150 meters. Right was away from the vehicles. She tracked him but didn't fire. He knew she was tracking him, She could see it in the quality of his movement, the way he was running with his body angled to minimize his profile, even while changing direction. He knew she had him. He was making himself a harder shot rather than running for the objective. Behind him, the second figure with the duffel had stopped entirely. He was looking toward the roof. He couldn't see her. She was backlit by nothing, and he was standing in the amber emergency light, which meant the visibility balance was in her favor. But he was looking in the right direction. He'd narrowed it down. She held her position, did not fire. Let him look. Let him understand. Then, from the south, from outside the base perimeter, from a direction she had not been monitoring because there was nothing south of Fort Callum except 40 miles of high desert, she heard something. It started as a vibration she felt in the roof gravel before she heard it with her ears. Then it became sound, a rhythmic thudding that built fast from nothing to everything in the span of about 8 seconds. The unmistakable acoustic signature of rotary wing aircraft approaching at low altitude. Not one. At least 3. She looked south. The lights came first, navigation lights, running dark but not invisible at this range. The formation pattern of military helicopters approaching an installation on a direct vector. Then the shapes, briefly lit by the base's emergency amber as they crossed the perimeter. UH-60s. 3 of them, flying low and fast with the specific aggressive geometry of aircraft that were not there to observe. Someone had answered Marin's transmission. She didn't know when, she didn't know who, she didn't know what they'd been told, or what they were coming in expecting to find. What she knew was that the calm voice on the captured radio had gone silent, and the figures on the parade ground had stopped moving, and the 2 men with the duffel were standing in the open looking south, and 40 trapped soldiers on the parade ground were watching 3 helicopters come in over the southern fence line, and every calculation on every side of the situation was being run simultaneously by every person involved. She lowered the rifle. Her arms were shaking. She hadn't noticed while she was shooting. Now, in the gap between firing and whatever came next, she became aware of it. The tremor in her forearms that happened after sustained fine motor work. The way precision costs something you didn't realize you were spending until the bill came. She sat down on the roof gravel, her back against the parapet, the rifle across her knees, the borrowed sidearm in her right hand, the roar of the helicopters getting louder, the lights getting brighter, the base below her reorganizing itself around a new variable that neither she nor the voice on the captured radio had put there. She looked at her hands. Steady enough, shaking slightly. Both true. She'd fired 8 times. She'd moved position 7 times. She'd put no one in the ground. Every shot had been a message. Every message had been the same. There is a cost to this objective that you did not price in, and I am the cost. Whether that was enough, whether the cost she represented was sufficient, or whether the calm voice would recalibrate and push through regardless, or whether the 3 helicopters represented something she'd been wrong about, she didn't know yet. She would know in the next few minutes. She sat on the cold gravel of the roof of Building 11 and listened to the helicopters come down, and below her, Fort Callum held its breath in the amber dark. And somewhere in the base, in the communications room with its red backup lighting, or on the parade ground with its dispersed and frightened soldiers, or in the interior of Building 11 where Carver was locked in a room with a case he didn't fully understand. Someone who had watched the night happen from a different angle was beginning to understand that they'd missed something, that there had been a variable, that the variable had a name, and that the name was not in the file. The first helicopter touched down on the parade ground at 4:53 in the morning. Claire heard it from the roof, the pitch change as the rotors slowed, the crunch of landing gear on packed earth, the immediate overlay of shouted commands and the clipped cadence of people who had arrived with a specific operational picture and were moving against it. She heard a second helicopter land somewhere near the motor pool. The third stayed airborne, circling, which told her it was carrying either observation equipment or someone who needed to see the full layout before committing to the ground. She didn't move from the parapet, not because she was too tired. She was, but that wasn't it. She stayed because moving from her position before she'd been identified and confirmed by whoever had just landed was the kind of mistake that got people shot in the confusing tail end of an operation, and she had not spent the last several hours keeping herself alive only to get shot by a response team in the last 5 minutes. She keyed the captured radio one more time. "Rooftop, Building 11, she said. "Friendly, single army personnel. I'm armed, but I'm not a threat. I'm going to stand up slowly, and I'd appreciate someone confirming they have eyes on me before any of your people point anything in my direction. Static. Then a new voice, different from the calm, commanding voice. This one shorter, more operational, the cadence of someone actively directing people. Rooftop personnel, identify. Staff Sergeant Claire Donovan, Fort Callum Communications Section. I've been on that roof for approximately 40 minutes. I fired 8 rounds from the northeast and northwest parapets. I have a M20-10 across my knees and a Beretta M9 in my right hand that I took off one of the attackers. Both weapons are currently pointed at the sky. A pause. Stand by, Sergeant. She stood by. Below her, the parade ground was resolving. She could hear it more than see it from her position. The sounds of the response team establishing control, voices identifying themselves, the particular exhausted relief of people who had been held at gunpoint and were now being told it was over. She heard someone crying. She heard someone laughing, the kind of laughing that happened when stress left the body too fast and had to go somewhere. She heard a voice she recognized as Marin's, higher pitched than usual, talking fast, and she allowed herself a small amount of relief about that. The third helicopter finally came down, somewhere south, near the perimeter gap. Donovan, the operational voice came back. Can you access the roof hatch without crossing the parapet? Yes. Come down. Leave the weapons on the roof. Someone will meet you at the Building 11 south entrance. She set the rifle down first, then the sidearm. Then she looked at the captured radio for a moment, decided it counted as evidence rather than a weapon, and kept it. She crossed to the hatch and went down. The man who met her at the south entrance was not what she expected, which was her fault for having expectations. He was short, genuinely short, not the impression of shortness that large spaces created, with a compact build and a face that had been weathered past the point where you could guess his age accurately. He was wearing civilian clothes under a tactical vest with no unit markings, and he held himself with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was a more efficient use of energy than movement. He had a badge on the vest, Federal. She could see the shape of it, but not the agency in the pre-dawn dark. He looked at her the way people looked at crime scenes, carefully, without reaction, taking inventory. Donovan, he said. Yes. I'm Whitfield. No rank, no agency, just the name. Can you walk? Yes. Good. Come with me. She fell in beside him, and they moved around the south side of Building 11 toward the area where the third helicopter had landed. The base around her was transformed. Lights were coming back on in sections as the response team worked through the grid, and she could see in the returning light the full scope of what the night had looked like from ground level. Blast damage at the eastern barracks entrance, scorch marks on the motor pool perimeter, the cut fence at the south gap with its tangled edge. The base looked like something between a raid site and a construction accident. 2 of the attackers were in zip restraints on the ground near the south gap. 3 more were being moved toward the helicopter landing zone. The man she'd disarmed inside Building 11, the one she'd put on the floor, was sitting with his back against the building's exterior wall, one wrist restrained to a D-ring that someone had bolted into the cinder block, his eyes tracking her as she walked past. She didn't look at him. Whitfield led her to a portable command station that had been set up beside the third helicopter. A fold-out table with 2 laptops and a satellite link, the kind of rapid deployment communications setup that cost more than most people's cars and could be operational in under 4 minutes. A woman was working one of the laptops. An older man in army uniform, colonel's insignia, she registered automatically, was standing beside the table with a mug of coffee and an expression that suggested he'd been awake for at least 24 hours and had moved past tired into something more sustainable and less comfortable. He looked up when she approached. Sergeant Donovan, he said. Sir? Colonel Prescott, Joint Operations Command. You're going to sit down before you fall down. He said it without looking away from his mug, the tone of a man issuing a practical instruction rather than a kindness. He gestured at a folding chair beside the table. There's coffee somewhere. Whitfield, find her coffee. Whitfield found her coffee. It was from a thermos, and it was still hot, and she drank it without tasting it because her body needed the temperature and the caffeine, and she wasn't inclined to have opinions about either. Walk me through it, Prescott said. He had a notepad. He was going to write things on it, which was either an affectation or a signal that what she said was going to exist on paper. From the beginning, what you observed, when you observed it, what you did about it, and in what order. She walked him through it. She kept it factual. She didn't editorialize and she didn't hedge, and she didn't leave things out, including the part about the armory key she shouldn't have had, and the part about the Briar Ridge confirmation protocol, and the part where she'd bluffed two armed men out of a doorway in the dark. She spoke for approximately 12 minutes without interruption, and when she finished, Prescott looked at his notepad for a moment. "The key," he said. "Yes, sir. You've been carrying an override key for a facility you're not cleared to access." "Yes, sir." "For 3 years." "Yes, sir." He wrote something down. "I'm not going to tell you that's not a problem. I didn't expect you to. But I will tell you that we can have a conversation about why you had it and how at a time when we're not standing in the middle of a compromised installation at 5 in the morning." He capped his pen. "The protocol. The Briar Ridge sequence. Where did you use it?" "On the captured radio. Someone on the attacker's frequency responded correctly." Prescott and Whitfield exchanged a look that lasted about half a second, the kind of exchange that carried a significant amount of information and was entirely illegible to anyone not already inside the conversation. "You're sure about the response?" Whitfield said. "I'm sure." "You ran the full sequence. All 7 steps. The responses were accurate at each step." Whitfield sat down on the edge of the table. He was very still for a moment, a different quality of stillness than before, more deliberate, something being processed behind eyes that weren't giving anything away. "That protocol was decommissioned when Briar Ridge was folded," he said. "The decommission was classified." "I'm aware." "Which means whoever responded to it either had access to the original documentation or was in the unit." "Yes," Claire said. Another exchange of looks between Whitfield and Prescott. Longer, this time. "The man in charge," Prescott said. "The one on the radio. Did you get a visual?" "No, never saw him." He mentioned the file he'd been given, his exact words. He said, "You weren't in the file I was given." "Yes, sir." Prescott wrote that down too. His handwriting was cramped and leftward leaning, the writing of someone who'd developed it under time pressure decades ago and never bothered to improve it. "We identified the operation leader from the helicopter observation," he said. "He was in the group near the motor pool. Name is Renner. Former contract intelligence. He's been working for a private firm out of the Pacific Northwest for about 18 months. Who hired the firm?" "That's what we're working on." He looked up from the notepad. "The drives. The battlefield management drives from Building 11. Your specialist Carver kept them secure." "He did a good job." "He did. The duffel from the west side of the building, do you know what was in it?" She looked at him. "You're going to tell me it wasn't equipment." "Communication intercept hardware. Specifically, a passive collection system that had been installed in Building 11's exterior wall sometime in the last 2 weeks, presumably by someone with access to the installation. It was designed to copy the encryption keys from the drives passively, without physical contact, during a transit stop." He paused. "If the operation had gone according to plan, they wouldn't have needed to breach Building 11 at all. They would have collected a full copy of the drive architecture from outside the wall, left the drives in place, left the hostages unharmed, and been gone before anyone on the base understood what had happened." She sat with that for a moment. "So the whole operation," she said, the hostages, the breach, the assault on the base, was a contingency," Prescott said. "When the passive collection system failed to complete its transfer, apparently a shielding issue in Building 11's construction that they hadn't accounted for in their site assessment, they moved to a direct extraction. Everything after that was improvisation." She thought about the calm voice on the radio, the organized way the attackers had moved through the base, the speed with which they'd adapted when she'd become a factor. "They improvised well," she said. "They did." His tone was neutral. "You improvised better." She didn't say anything to that. He looked at her. Not the inventory look that Whitfield had used. Something more evaluative. The look of someone assembling an opinion from evidence gathered over a short period under difficult conditions. "Your record," he said. "The version in your personnel file." "Yes, sir." "I've been in operational command for 19 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of redacted files. What's in yours isn't a redaction. It's a replacement. Someone took your actual service record and put a different one in its place. The kind of thing that's done when someone needs to disappear a capability rather than a person. She kept her face neutral. Fort Callum, she said. Overnight communications. 7 months. 7 months, he repeated. After Briar Ridge was classified and folded and everyone associated with it was either promoted somewhere inconvenient or reassigned to somewhere forgettable. He set his notepad down. Who made the decision to bury your record? I don't know. Guess. I don't guess, sir. It wastes time. He almost smiled. It was brief and not particularly warm, but it was real. Fair enough. He picked up his coffee. The installation's internal security footage is being pulled right now. We'll have a full reconstruction within a few hours. I'm going to need you available for the debrief, which is going to be thorough, which is going to take most of today. Understood. Is there anything you need before that starts? She thought about it honestly. I haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon, she said. And I have a specialist in the communications room who held his position all night on a frequency he'd never used before and transmitted continuously until you picked it up. He should be debriefed first. Prescott looked at her for a moment. We'll get you both fed, he said. The debrief formally began at 8 o'clock in the morning in a room that Fort Callum's administration used for contractor meetings, and that the response team had appropriated for the day. It was an ordinary conference room, laminate table, ergonomic chairs that didn't quite fit the table height, a projector screen with a crack running through its lower left corner that someone had repaired with clear tape. The tape had yellowed. Claire had eaten. She'd also changed uniforms. Someone had found her one from the supply room that fit adequately, if not well, and she was wearing it now, sitting at the conference table across from Whitfield and a woman who'd been introduced as Agent Carla Seong, whom Claire placed immediately as the one who'd been working the laptop at the command station, and who had the particular focus of someone who had already read everything available and was now looking for the gaps between the documents. Prescott was at the head of the table. Beside him, to Claire's considerable lack of surprise, was Major Hargrove. He looked wrong in the daylight. That was the only way she could put it. In the dining hall, in his element, with his size and his rank and his audience, he had a quality of self-possession that read as confidence. In this room, in this morning, with the base around him still carrying the evidence of a night he hadn't controlled, he looked like a man wearing an expression that didn't quite fit the situation, trying for authority and finding it slightly out of reach. He hadn't spoken since she sat down. Seong started the debrief at Prescott's nod. She took Claire through the timeline in detail: start time, first observation, decision points, actions taken. She asked good questions, the kind that were looking for information rather than confirmation. Claire answered them fully, and she answered them accurately, and she did not soften anything. When they reached the communications room sequence, the first anomaly she'd spotted in the perimeter data, Seong stopped her. You ran a manual diagnostic at 2240, Seong said. That's outside standard protocol for overnight comms. Yes. What made you run it? A sensor dropout in Sector 3 that was logged as environmental. The environmental conditions at that time didn't match the dropout's origin direction. You checked weather data. I check weather data at the start of every shift. It's habit. That kind of attention to concurrent data sets isn't... Seong paused, chose her words. It's not standard communications work. No, Claire said. A pause. Seong looked at her. Do you want to tell me where it comes from? I expect you've already inferred where it comes from. I want you to say it. Claire looked at the table for a moment. Not evasively. She was deciding how to say the next part in a way that was accurate without being theatrical, because she'd found that theatricality in formal settings always made things worse. Before my transfer to Fort Callum, she said, I was assigned to a classified direct action support unit operating under the Briar Ridge program. The unit's operational focus was long-range precision engagement and associated intelligence support for time-sensitive targeting. I was the unit's primary engagement specialist for approximately 4 years. I deployed to active conflict environments on 14 occasions. My service record as it currently exists in the Army personnel system does not reflect any of this. The room was quiet. Hargrove was the one who broke the quiet, and she gave him some credit for that. You're a sniper, he said. The word came out flat. Not derisive. The derision was gone, or at least suspended. More like a man stating a fact he was encountering for the first time despite having been in the same room with the fact for months. The Army uses designated marksman, or precision engagement specialist, for the formal designation, she said. But yes. Hargrove looked at the table. Prescott said, the 14 deployments, your current file shows 2, both administrative support. Yes, sir. Who filed the replacement record? I was told the reassignment was processed through the Briar Ridge Decommission Authority. I didn't receive documentation. I was told my record would be simplified for the receiving installation. I understood simplified to mean classified. It appears to have meant replaced. Did you consent to the replacement? She took a breath. I was not given the option to refuse it. The statement settled into the room the way certain statements did, with a weight that made people consider what they were going to say next more carefully than they'd considered the previous thing. Seong wrote something. Whitfield was watching Claire with an expression that she was beginning to read as the particular form of interest that people in his line of work applied to situations that had developed further than they'd been briefed on. The key, Whitfield said. The Armory override key. Who gave it to you? Unit Commander at Briar Ridge, standard issue for personnel with my classification level. Name? Lieutenant Colonel Dax Ferris. Whitfield wrote that down. There was something in the speed with which he wrote it, a recognition, the way you wrote something down differently when it was a name you'd expected to hear eventually and were now encountering. You know that name, Claire said. He looked up. We're following several threads from last night. Some of them lead in directions we weren't expecting. He capped his pen. I'll tell you what I can when I can. It was not an answer. She accepted it as the shape of an answer that was coming later. Seong moved the debrief forward into the specifics of what she'd fired at and why, the sequence of positions, the decision to disable the vehicle rather than engage personnel directly. Each question was precise, and she answered each one precisely, and the picture that assembled itself in the room over the next 2 hours was the full account of what she'd done and how and the reasoning behind every decision. At 10:45, Prescott called a break. Most people left the room. Claire stayed, partly because she wasn't sure where she would go if she left, partly because sitting was better than standing at the moment, and she was determined not to show how much the night had cost her until she was somewhere private. Hargrove stayed too. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. He was at the far end of the table, turned sideways in his chair, looking at the yellowed tape on the projector screen with the expression of a man thinking about something he hadn't figured out how to start. She waited. The dining hall, he said finally. Major, I'm not... He stopped. Started again. I'm not looking for a way out of it. I'm just saying it. The dining hall. He looked at her. His face was tired in the particular way that wasn't sleep deprivation. It was something that had taken its time arriving during the course of the morning and had settled in now to stay. I didn't know. You didn't need to, she said. That's not how it's supposed to work. I grabbed your collar. Yes. In front of 40 people. Yes. He looked at the table again. I've grabbed soldiers before when they were in my way. Not like, I didn't think about it. That's what I keep coming back to. I didn't think about it at all. You were just... He stopped. In your way? She said. Yeah. He said it quietly. She didn't soften it. Not because she wanted to make it worse for him. She didn't. She had spent most of the night doing things that were considerably more pressing than revisiting Hargrove's behavior in the dining hall. But because he was sitting with something real and softening it would let him put it down before he'd finished holding it. The soldiers you were protecting last night, she said after a moment. 40 of them. They're all going home today. Most of them don't know why. Some of them will find out eventually. Most of them won't. She looked at him directly. That part is done. Whatever you do with the rest of it is up to you. He didn't respond right away. People filtered back into the room. Seong came back first, then Whitfield, then 2 other members of the response team Claire hadn't been introduced to. Prescott came in last, carrying a fresh mug of coffee and a folder, and before he'd fully settled into his chair, he was already reading from the folder with the efficiency of someone who'd used his break to do work. Surveillance footage, he said. We've completed the first pass. He set the folder down and looked at Claire. 8 firing positions, 7 transitions between positions, 1 vehicle disabled, 1 fence gap sealed, 2 armed personnel deterred from the motor pool, 1 entry deterred at the parade ground perimeter, 0 casualties. He paused. In approximately 40 minutes. The room was quiet. With a rifle you weren't authorized to have, he continued. From a facility you accessed with a key you weren't supposed to retain, using training that isn't in your official record. He closed the folder. I want to be careful about how I say the next part because it has some legal complexity attached to it that I don't want to gloss over. The unauthorized access and the retained key are issues that need to be resolved through proper channels. I'm not dismissing them. I understand, sir. But the footage is what the footage is. And what the footage is a single soldier who identified a compromised situation before anyone else on this installation did, who acted on that identification without support, who made a series of decisions under pressure that protected both the installation's personnel and a classified asset, and who did all of it in a way that resulted in every hostile personnel being either detained or driven off the installation without a single additional casualty. He looked at her steadily. That's also what it is. She didn't respond. She wasn't sure what responding would look like. Seong said, "We're going to need to address the record." "Yes," Prescott said. "Formally," Seong said. "Not just a note in the file, full reconstruction. What was replaced has to be restored." "I'm aware. There are 14 deployments that don't exist on paper. There's a unit designation that's been buried. There's a classification level she's been operating below for 7 months that..." Seong stopped, seemed to make a decision about how much to say in the current setting. "It's significant, sir." "I know it's significant," Prescott said. "Does she know what was done to it? The record? Does she know the scope?" Prescott looked at Claire. It was a question directed at Seong, but it was aimed at her. "I knew it was replaced," Claire said. "I didn't know how completely." "We'll walk you through it," Seong said. She said it with a directness that was not unkind. The tone of someone who understood that information about one's own history was a different category of information than information about events. Today, probably, or tomorrow at the latest. Some of it may be difficult. "All right," Claire said. Hargrove, who had been silent since the room refilled, spoke again. "She's still assigned to the overnight comms rotation," he said. He said it to Prescott, not to her. The tone was odd, not his usual authority, something more careful. "Her unit assignment, the administrative reassignment that put her here, is that where she's..." Prescott looked at him. "That's a good question, Major." "I'm not asking because I want her moved," Hargrove said. He said it quickly. Then he seemed to hear how it sounded and slowed down. "I'm asking because I don't know what the right thing is, and I want to know what it is." Prescott turned back to Claire. "What do you want?" he asked. She looked at him. It was not a question she'd been asked in a formal setting in a very long time. In her experience, formal settings generated assignments rather than questions about preferences. "I'd like my record to accurately reflect what I've done," she said. "The rest I can figure out." Prescott nodded once, wrote something in the folder. Whitfield leaned forward. "The man on the radio, Renner. He's in custody, but he's not talking. Not yet." He looked at her. "He asked about you before we moved him to the holding facility. He asked the transporting officer who the shooter was." "What did the transporting officer say?" "He didn't know. He told Renner it was a communications sergeant." Something crossed Renner's face when he heard that, apparently. Not anger, not surprise, but something that the transporting officer had described as looking almost like recognition. The way you looked when a piece of information arrived that answered a question you'd been carrying. She didn't know what to do with that, and she didn't try to solve it in this room. "The Briar Ridge response," she said to Whitfield, "from the radio. Someone in that operation knew the protocol. Are you going to be able to trace it?" "We're going to try," he said. "Colonel Ferris," she said. "The key. The record replacement. Whether any of that connects to the people who hired Renner's firm." "Those are the questions we're working," Whitfield said. He met her eyes. "I won't insult you by telling you we'll share everything with you, but I'll tell you this. The threads you've identified are the ones we're pulling." She accepted that. Prescott stood, which ended the formal session. People around the table began gathering things, talking in low voices. The room beginning its transition from the compressed intensity of a debrief to the looser energy of people moving toward their next task. Martinez was outside the door when Claire came out, standing in the corridor, still in the uniform she'd been wearing all night, the split lip more visible in daylight than it had been in the dark. She straightened when she saw Claire. "Ma'am," she said. The form of address was slightly off. Claire was a sergeant, not an officer, but Martinez said it anyway, and neither of them pointed that out. "Martinez," Claire said, "how's your lip?" "Medic says it'll close on its own." She paused. "Carver told me what you did. In the building." "Carver did good work." "He said you told him to get above it, take the high ground." Martinez looked at her steadily. "He said you went back to the door. The case needed to be protected. From people who didn't know you existed." Claire looked at her. "You didn't have to go back to that door," Martinez said. "With one borrowed pistol and 6 rounds. Nobody told you to." "Nobody told me not to," Claire said. Martinez almost smiled. It was brief, and then it was gone, the way things were brief when you'd been through a long night and hadn't slept and were still processing what that night had asked of you. "Thank you," Martinez said. Claire nodded. Then she walked down the corridor toward the part of the base that had working coffee and a room with a chair she could sit in alone for 5 minutes, which was all she needed, and exactly what she wasn't going to tell anyone she needed, because needing 5 minutes alone was personal, and the rest of this day was going to be professional, and she'd learned a long time ago to keep those two things from bleeding into each other in the middle of a situation that wasn't finished yet. Behind her, through this conference room wall, she could hear Prescott's voice and Whitfield's voice, and after a pause, Hargrove's voice, all of them talking about a night she was already reconstructing from the outside in, not as something she'd survived, but as something she now had to account for, which was a different kind of work. She found the coffee. She found a chair. She sat down, and the chair faced a window, and through the window she could see the parade ground where the response team was still working, taking measurements, placing markers, photographing the things that needed to be photographed before the base could return to something resembling its ordinary shape. The sun was fully up now. She hadn't noticed when that had happened. She sat with her coffee and looked at the light on the parade ground and thought about nothing useful for approximately 4 minutes, which was close enough to 5 that she counted it. Then she went back to work. The work that afternoon was administrative, in the way that aftermath was always administrative. Forms, statements, a second debrief session that covered the same ground as the first, but with different people asking the questions, and a recording device on the table that hadn't been there before. Claire answered everything she was asked. She signed what she was given to sign. She initialed the places she was told to initial. She did it without complaint and without the performance of cooperation, just the actual thing, because the process existed for reasons she understood, and the fastest way through it was straight. By 3 in the afternoon, she was back in the communications room. Not because anyone had sent her there, because it was her shift location, and she didn't have orders reassigning her, and in the absence of orders, she defaulted to her post. Marin was there. He'd been released from his own debrief session 2 hours earlier and had apparently come back for the same reason she had, because it was where he was supposed to be, and neither of them knew what else to do with the tail end of a day that had started in the middle of the previous night. He looked up when she came in. He'd been staring at a console he wasn't operating, the way people stared at familiar objects when they needed something to look at that wasn't the inside of their own heads. "You don't have to be here," she said. "Neither do you," he said. She sat at her console. The main grid was back up. Someone from the response team's technical unit had restored primary power around noon, and the communications room was running on its normal systems again, the status indicators back to their regular green, the whole board looking exactly as it had before 2200 hours the previous evening, except that Claire now knew what it looked like when 4 of those indicators were lying. "The backscatter frequency," she said. "The one I configured. Who picked it up?" "I don't know exactly," Marin said. "Someone from Whitfield's unit, I think. They told me during the debrief that the transmission was received at 2347, but they wouldn't tell me who was monitoring that band or why." 2347. 43 minutes after she'd configured the transmitter and sent Marin onto the frequency. She'd spent 43 minutes not knowing if anyone was coming. She had not, during those 43 minutes, allowed herself to calculate the odds that no one would come. She understood now that the calculation would have been more favorable than it felt, because someone had been monitoring that band for reasons connected to threads Whitfield was pulling. But she hadn't known that at 2240 with the board dark and the base under assault, and she was glad she hadn't, because knowing it might have changed something in the way she'd moved through the night, and she didn't want to examine too closely what that change might have been. "You did well," she said to Marin. He was quiet for a moment. "I kept thinking I was doing it wrong," he said. "The transmission, the format. I kept second-guessing whether I was on the right frequency, whether anyone could hear it, whether... He stopped. I just kept talking into it. That's all it needed to be, she said. He nodded slowly. He looked about 16 years old in the afternoon light, which he wasn't. He was 22. But the night had taken something from his face that made him look younger rather than older, the specific effect of an experience that arrived before a person had fully assembled their defenses against it. Are you okay? She asked him. He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. I think so, he said. I don't know yet. I think I need a couple of days to find out. That's a reasonable answer, she said. She turned back to her console and ran the standard startup sequence, not because anything needed to be started, the board was already running, but because the sequence was familiar and familiar, things had value at the end of a long night that had bled into a long day. Whitfield came to find her at 16:30. He came alone, without Prescott, without Seong, without the formal weight of the morning's debrief. He knocked on the communications room door, which she found unexpectedly considerate, given that he was federal and could have walked in without knocking. And when she opened it, he looked at Marin and then at her. Can we talk? He said. She told Marin she'd be back and stepped outside with Whitfield. They walked toward the vehicle depot without a stated destination, which meant he needed to say something that required motion, the kind of conversation that was easier when you were moving because it removed the obligation of sustained eye contact. Ferris, he said. She waited. Lieutenant Colonel Dax Ferris, the unit commander who issued your key and oversaw your reassignment out of Briar Ridge. We've been looking at him for 8 months in connection with a separate matter. The operation last night, the passive collection system in Building 11's wall, the hired firm, the target package that didn't include you, all of it traces back to a private intelligence broker who has been purchasing access to classified programs through former insiders. He paused. Ferris is one of those insiders. She heard it. She let it settle. He built the operation package, she said. He provided the drive architecture specifications, the Building 11 layout, the transit schedule for the classified shipment, and the personnel assessment for Fort Callum. Whitfield kept walking. The personnel assessment listed 37 individuals as potential complications. You were not among them. Because my record doesn't show what I can do. Because your record was rebuilt by Ferris himself after Briar Ridge was decommissioned, Whitfield said. He had administrative authority over the reassignment process for all Briar Ridge personnel. He used that authority to simplify every record, his word, based on a document we recovered. But for most of the unit, simplifying meant classifying. For you, it meant replacing. We don't know yet whether that was targeted or incidental. She stopped walking. Whitfield stopped too, half a step ahead of her, and turned around. He stripped my record specifically, she said. It appears so. We don't have his reasoning yet. We may not get it. He's currently in a location we can see but not reach without going through a legal process that will take time. He met her eyes. I want to be straight with you. This may take months to resolve completely. The record reconstruction, the accountability process, all of it. The Army does not move fast on things that implicate its own administrative infrastructure. I know, she said. But it will move, he said. Prescott is personally overseeing it. He doesn't do that for things he plans to let stall. She looked at the vehicle depot wall, at the scorch marks from the motor pool breach, still there in the afternoon light, ugly and factual, and not going anywhere until someone with the right equipment came to clean them up. The key, she said. Charges are being declined, Whitfield said. Given the circumstances of the night and the evidentiary value of how you used it, Prescott made the call this morning. It stays in your record as a notation, not a violation. She nodded. They stood there for a moment. The wind was still from the northwest. It had been all day, consistent, the same direction it had been when she'd calculated it on the observation tower and on the roof, and from every position she'd held through the long hours between midnight and dawn. What happens to me now? She asked. Not with anxiety. It was a practical question, the next operational variable to account for. That's actually what I came to talk to you about, Whitfield said. He reached into his jacket and produced a card. Plain, no logo, just a phone number, and the initials JOC in the corner. Prescott wants to meet with you next week. Not a debrief, a conversation about your assignment. He held out the card. He has a position in mind. He wanted me to tell you that before the meeting, so you're not walking in blind. She took the card, looked at it. What position? Precision support and site security assessment for high-value transit operations, Whitfield said. Specifically, installations that handle classified material in transit. Someone who can look at a Building 11 situation before it becomes a Building 11 situation. She turned the card over. The back was blank. He's asking, Whitfield said, not assigning. He was specific about that. Why? Whitfield looked at her with the expression of a man who had been briefed on her history and understood something about the sequence of events that had brought her to Fort Callum. Because the last person who made decisions about your assignment without asking you made a significant error in judgment, he said. And because the surveillance footage from last night is the kind of footage that changes how people think about what they've been doing with certain resources. She put the card in her pocket. Tell him I'll be there, she said. But the formal assembly happened 4 days later. It was not a ceremony in the polished sense. Fort Callum was still operating in a modified posture while the investigation continued, and Prescott had been explicit that he didn't want performance, he wanted acknowledgement. There was a difference, and he seemed to understand it. The assembly was in the main hall, which could hold the installation's full personnel complement if people stood close. Most of them did. The overnight communications section was there, Marin in the second row, standing straight in a way that suggested he'd pressed his uniform for the first time in recent memory. Osei was there, her head cut heeled to a thin scab above her left ear. Carver and Martinez stood together at the left side of the room, both in fresh uniforms, both with the self-contained expression of people who'd been through something and weren't interested in being dramatic about it. Hargrove was there. He was in the front row, off to one side, and he stood with the careful posture of a man who had decided that the right position for him today was somewhere he could see clearly without being centered. Prescott stood at the front of the room. He was not using notes. He spoke for 6 minutes. He covered the events of the night of the assault factually and without embellishment, in the direct way that military briefings covered events when they wanted the events themselves to carry the weight rather than the language describing them. He covered the outcome. 41 military personnel protected, a classified asset secured, 11 hostile personnel detained. He covered what the surveillance footage showed, and he quoted specific figures: 8 firing positions, 7 transitions, 8 rounds fired, 0 casualties among Fort Callum personnel. Then he talked about Staff Sergeant Claire Donovan. He didn't call her a hero. She was relieved by that. The word had a quality of completion that made her uncomfortable, as though the thing it described was finished rather than ongoing. He said, Sergeant Donovan identified a threat before anyone else on this installation did. She acted on that identification with the training and judgment of a soldier whose full capabilities were not reflected in her assigned role. What she did in the hours between 2200 and 0500 kept every person in this room from a significantly worse outcome. The Army owes her an accurate account of who she is and what she has done, and we are in the process of providing that. He paused. She will also be receiving the Army Commendation Medal with Valor device, effective immediately. There was a silence, and then the room responded. Not the theatrical silence before applause of a ceremony, but the genuine, slightly disorganized response of people who'd been through a shared experience and were reacting to its culmination with imperfect human variability. Some people applauded. Some didn't. Marin was applauding with the wholehearted unself-consciousness of someone who hadn't thought about whether that was appropriate and had simply done it. Osei was not applauding, but she had an expression that was more than an expression, something full and tired and relieved that her face was apparently not big enough to fully contain. Claire stood at the front of the room and let the moment be what it was. She did not feel vindicated in the way that stories described vindication. She felt tired. She felt the residual ache in her forearms from the sustained rifle work. She felt the odd, slightly dissociated quality of being looked at by a room full of people who were seeing something new when they looked at her, and the intellectual awareness that what they were seeing had always been there, and the complicated, not entirely comfortable feeling of having that finally be visible. Prescott pinned the medal himself. His hands were precise and efficient about it. He'd done this before, many times, and it showed in the lack of fumbling, the 2-second contact, the step back. Well done, Sergeant, he said quietly. Thank you, sir, she said. Hargrove found her afterward. Not immediately. He waited until the room had mostly cleared, until the natural dispersal of people after a formal event had created enough space that what he was doing didn't have an audience. She was near the door, talking briefly with Seong about a document she'd need to sign the following morning, when she saw him waiting at a respectful distance with his hands behind his back. Seong glanced over her shoulder, read the situation, wrapped up what she was saying in half the words it would have taken otherwise, and left. Hargrove walked over. He looked like he'd been preparing what he was going to say and had decided, sometime in the last few seconds, to abandon what he'd prepared. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one. Not a... I've been thinking about how to do this so it doesn't sound like I'm making it about me, and I don't know if I've figured that out, so I'm just going to say it." He met her eyes. "What I did in the dining hall was wrong. It would have been wrong regardless of who you were or what you'd done or what was in your file. I treated you like you didn't matter, in front of people, because I decided you didn't matter, and that was a failure of character, not just judgment." She looked at him. "I know an apology doesn't fix what it felt like," he said. "I'm not asking you to tell me it's fine." "It's not fine," she said. "It was a bad night before the bad night started." He absorbed that. "Yeah," he said. "But I'm not carrying it," she said. "I don't have room for it. If you want to do something useful with it, do something useful with it. The next person who ends up in your unit with a simplified record and a job below their capability, pay attention to them." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll do that," he said. He extended his hand. She shook it. Brief, firm, without ceremony. He walked away, and she watched him go. And she thought that he would probably keep his word. Not because the night had transformed him, because people weren't transformed by single events the way stories suggested, but because he was a man who'd made a mistake that had been displayed to him at a scale that made it impossible to minimize, and some people, confronted with that, chose to actually change rather than just feel bad about themselves. She didn't know which kind he was. She thought he might be the first kind. She decided it wasn't her job to monitor which. She went to the firing range that evening. She went alone after the base had settled into its modified overnight posture, when the range was empty and the targets were the simple paper kind with the concentric rings and no tactical complexity whatsoever. She requisitioned a rifle through the proper channels, submitted the form, waited for the authorization, carried the weapon to the range herself, and she shot until the light was fully gone and she was working by the range's overhead floods. She was not shooting well. This surprised her less than it would have surprised anyone watching. She'd been awake for going on 36 hours at this point. Her fine motor control was degraded, and the accumulated tension of the previous night had left her muscles operating at a quality slightly below their baseline. Her groupings were acceptable. They were not what she was capable of. She kept shooting, not to demonstrate anything, not to prove anything to the empty range. She shot because shooting was the specific work that her specific capability required maintenance in, and because the forms and the debriefs and the assembly and the handshake and the medal had all been necessary, and she had moved through all of them with the same steady professionalism she brought to everything, and now she needed to do something that was just work without any of the surrounding weight. She shot for 45 minutes. Her groupings improved over that time, not dramatically but measurably. She could see it in the targets, the slow tightening of the pattern as her body remembered what it was doing, and the noise of the day receded into background. By the last magazine, she was shooting at a level she was willing to accept, which was not the same as the level she held herself to at her best, but was an honest accounting of where she was tonight and what was reasonable to expect of herself given the circumstances. She unloaded the weapon, cleared it, performed the post-use maintenance with the careful thoroughness that she'd been trained to apply and had never stopped applying even when the training was the thing she wasn't supposed to have. She sat on the shooting bench with the cleared weapon across her knees and looked at the targets downrange. She thought about what Prescott had offered. The position. Precision support and site security assessment. Looking at installations the way she'd looked at Fort Callum's perimeter data on the night someone else was already looking at it, except earlier, before the spoofed sensors, before the cut fence, before the 40 people on the parade ground in the middle of the night. She thought about Marin saying, "I just kept talking into it." About Osei noting that the person herding them toward the parade ground wasn't in uniform and making the call not to go, alone, barefoot, 19 years old, and correct. About Carver holding a case in the dark at the top of a utility ladder because someone had told him to, and he decided to trust that instruction. She thought about her own record, the 14 deployments that didn't exist on paper, the unit designation that would now be restored, The 4 years that had been replaced with 2 administrative support postings, and what it had cost to carry that replacement around for 3 years while it quietly rearranged what other people were allowed to see when they looked at her. She thought about Hargrove's hand in hers, the brief, firm, unceremonious contact. She wasn't finished being angry about the dining hall. She'd told him she wasn't carrying it, which was true. She wasn't going to let it occupy space she needed for other things. But not carrying something and being done with it weren't the same thing, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference. The anger was still there. It was just filed, the way she filed things, in a place where it couldn't get in the way of what she needed to do. Maybe someday she'd be done with it. Tonight it was filed. She stood up, picked up the weapon, carried it back to the armory, the official armory, the one she was authorized to access, the one that required the forms she had filled out and the authorization she had received, and returned it through proper channels and signed the release sheet and walked back toward the communications building. The night was clear. Northwest wind, 6 or 7 knots, a little lighter than the previous night. Good visibility. Stars in the quantity that appeared over high desert when you were far enough from city lights, which Fort Callum was. She stopped outside the communications building and looked at the sky for a moment. Not for any particular reason, just because it was there, and she had a moment that wasn't already occupied, and sometimes that was enough reason. Then she went inside. 1 week later, she was in Prescott's office in a building 40 miles from Fort Callum, sitting in a chair that was more comfortable than the conference room chairs had been, across a desk that held a specific folder she recognized as her own personnel file by the thickness of it. Prescott was looking at the folder. She'd been looking at it for the past 3 minutes while he reviewed something near the back. The folder was thicker than it should have been under the previous version of her record. Someone had already begun the reconstruction work. He closed it. "You read the offer," he said. "Yes, sir." "Questions?" "1," she said. "The assessment work, the site evaluations. Would I be doing them alone or with a team?" He looked at her. "We'd be building the team around you," he said, "which means you'd have significant input into who's on it." She thought about Marin and his 36-hour transmission into an uncertain frequency. About Osei reading the situation at 19 with bare feet and no weapon and getting it right. About Carver on a rooftop ladder with a case he'd been told to protect. "I might have some names," she said. Prescott almost smiled. It was the same almost smile he'd produced in the conference room. Brief, not warm exactly, but real. "I had a feeling," he said. He opened the folder to a specific page and turned it toward her. "Before you sign anything, I want you to see this." She looked at the page. It was her service record. The real one. 14 deployments, documented. Unit designation, restored. Classification level, accurate. The 4 years at Briar Ridge, present and accounted for in the careful language of military documentation, which was not dramatic language but which was exact, and exactness was what she'd needed it to be. She looked at it for a long time, not because she needed to read it carefully. She knew what was there. She had lived what was there. But because there was something that happened when a true thing was put back where it belonged after years of being somewhere else, and that something required a moment to move through before she could continue past it. She looked up. "It's accurate," she said. "It's accurate," Prescott confirmed. She picked up the pen he'd set beside the folder. She signed. She returned to the firing range at Fort Callum one last time before her orders processed and her assignment changed. She went in the afternoon, when the light was good and the wind was the same reliable northwest it had been all week, and she shot with the focus and precision that she held herself to at her actual best, rather than the grace-adjusted standard of an exhausted night. Her groupings were what they should be. She collected the targets afterward and looked at them the way she always looked at finished targets. Not with satisfaction, but with assessment, with the honest measurement of where she was and what she still needed to work on, because competence was not a destination, and she'd long since stopped treating it as one. She folded the targets, put them in her jacket pocket, cleaned the weapon and returned it. On her way back through the base, she passed the dining hall. She went inside. Not because she was hungry, she'd already eaten. She went inside because it was an ordinary room and she was done letting it be anything else. She took a tray from the stack. She went through the line and collected what was available. She carried her tray to the table near the emergency exit, near the window, back to the wall, and she sat down. She ate alone. Around her, the dining hall ran its ordinary noise. The clatter of trays, the low current of conversation, the hiss from the fryers, and the smell of coffee that had been on too long. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The specific texture of a place that wasn't extraordinary and didn't need to be. She ate her meal and she drank her coffee, and nobody grabbed her collar. When she was finished, she returned her tray to the disposal station and walked out. The wind was still from the northwest. She walked back to the communications building for the last time, and the base was the ordinary base it was supposed to be, and the people in it were doing the ordinary work they were supposed to be doing, and somewhere in a folder on a desk 40 miles away, a record existed that said exactly who she was and what she'd done. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough. The people who underestimate you are not always wrong about the world, but they are always wrong about you. What you carry in silence is still yours. What you know is still true. And when the moment arrives that asks for everything you have, the only question that matters is whether you are willing to keep it ready. Not for recognition, not for applause, but because the work itself was always worth doing right.